at a country level, what country was most exposed for tax, a tax disadvantage to their local, companies there?
Australia.
Absolutely. $1,000 de minimis. Imagine all the goods coming in from China, US, all these sellers selling into Australia when it's under 1,000, not having to pay tax, which still does happen today, which we can touch on. So Australia actually started use again before the whole Wayfair thing, or during the same time, right? There's people, these countries, they're trying to figure out how to get their money. And Australia came out with a law, which is to collect GST or for companies outside of their jurisdiction to register for GST, but it doesn't apply to all of them. So talk to me a little bit about Australia. Yeah. How does the Australia low value tax scheme work? And also, how does it work when it's not low value, right? Let's go through that.
No, that's a good segue into this, which is, they saw a massive hole in their tax revenue and in the competitiveness of their local businesses. And it was interesting to watch before, if I rewind 10 plus years, I was at an e-commerce seller, and guess what? Australia was a big lane for us, right? Because we could sell in there duty and tax free for pretty much all of our shipments. We had, we very rarely did we have a high value shipment. And I heard rumblings for years about them lowering the de minimis because they had to stop the bleeding somehow,
stop the bleeding. But what would be the consequence if they lowered the de minimis? Like what are the trade-offs there?
Well, now they also have to increase the staff and resources needed to actually assess and collect that duty and tax. And you get a diminishing rate of return when you're trying to collect tax on a very low value shipment. It often doesn't justify the resources needed to do that. And so nothing ever really happened. And then someone got the bright idea in Australia to say, hey, you know what? What if we put the burden of assessing and collecting and remitting tax, what if we shifted that from customs to the online retailer? And I'm sure there was some discussions in the room about, okay, how do we do this? And then also, do we want this to apply to everybody? Yeah. And I think they've recognized that this may not be a burden they want to place on the small sellers. So they put in a threshold of if you're selling more than 75,000 Australian dollars worth of goods into Australia in a year, then you're supposed to register. And then you have to collect the sales tax at checkout and remit that directly to Australia.
So really they were targeting the Amazons of the world, these big market eBays, right? The big marketplaces that were selling into there. And they had some success with this. I mean, I think it was actually wildly more successful than they thought. I think that the US market is extremely compliant with stuff like this, especially because Wayfair had just come out. And so for merchants that are over that 70,000 a year threshold AUD, they've pretty much been self-reporting.
Yep.
And that's okay. In the US, I would say that's pretty accurate. I say the majority, maybe a little over the majority. I don't know. 50, 60, 70% would be my guess. Who knows? Australia will know at some point, right? Like, so China's a whole nother ball of wax. I don't know how compliant they've been going into Australia, but this was very successful and it started to bleed into other countries. And maybe we get to that in a second. But if you're under 70,000, if you're selling under that 70,000 threshold, then how does it work? Like, does it get collected?
Status quo. Same as always. Duty and tax free under 1,000 Australian dollars.
Okay.
So you can still leverage that advantage to make Australia a big market for you until you hit that threshold, and then you have to register and remit.
But unless the exception is if you're using even if you're under that threshold, if you're utilizing a third party as your merchant record service, like Shopify Markets Pro is a classic example, right? Where you can use them and their provider as this merchant record service, and immediately now you're there. Yeah, because you're under their umbrella.
Yep.
So everything you might not have before signing up had any tax getting applied going into Australia, and now you do.
Yep.
Okay. But it's for the SMB, Australia might not be the one that they have to worry about the most. right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it's just
SMB Australia is going to be
SMB.
something to keep an eye on for.
Well, and monitor thresholds. Once you pass it, register, you get your ID. And that's what, I mean, I think, you know, you have to obtain what are the steps? Let's go through them real quick. How do you get a,
Yeah, so you just, I mean, it's.
how do you do this if you have to do it?
Here's the great thing about it. Australia, now, laws that have followed in other countries since then aren't as straightforward as Australia. Australia is pretty straightforward. You see, there's some, you monitor your cells. If you hit the threshold, they made a simplified system for anybody outside of Australia to go in and register and get a tax ID. But it's not a full-blown tax ID as if you were an Australian business.
You get the ID, right? It's called an AUS ID, right? An Australian ID through an online service.
Yep.
But then you have to register with that ID for simplified GST.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Then now you can start collecting.
Yep. And it's super straightforward, way simpler than US sales tax. It's 10% GST. And then you start shipping, and then but on the shipment you've got to identify that you got your tax ID.
You got your tax ID.
But
so there's some things on the documentation you're supposed to do
but it's still really, really simple, because for customs, for them processing it, if it's under $1,000 they don't do anything. Right. It's really the honor system that it's at the government level. There's somebody, I don't know who's actually doing it, but they're watching sellers and they're watching thresholds. They're using that data, and they're going after the big offenders that aren't registered and remitting, and then they're working their way down the list.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, and now in the case of Zonos, and I didn't talk about this with the US, just to let the audience know, like, we do help with our landed cost guarantee. We're taking care of all of this, right? And you don't trigger any threshold issues because we're doing it on your behalf. But we can, you know, calculate, we'll collect it from you, we'll register, we'll remit it, which is quarterly, into Australia, and take care of that. Watch your thresholds by country, or if you're outside the United States, by state into the US. So we're helping do all of this, whether it goes above or below the threshold. And if it goes above 1,000, again, it's just going to go through the normal process. It will be collected at the border.
Yep.
Okay.